There is something sexy about aeroplanes. It is such a cornerstone in shaping our world today. There are other industries that have similar complexity. It gets into you. My entire life was always around aviation. It has to be around aviation since my dad was a pilot. I did a transition into headhunting, and Korn Ferry is the world's largest human capital advisory firm. So we work on both organizational design as well as the people that go into that organization.
People in their careers, they will face these setbacks that are beyond their control. What should people?
You need to be much more active in shaping your career. And that can be audacious. I've met plenty of people who said in their 20s, I'm going to be a CEO. The good thing is that that doesn't mean it will happen, but if you've been very good at articulating and you have a plan, we certainly believe that there's a change in the career path of an airline CEO. CEOs tend to be type A personalities, so they tend to drive hard. Think historically about someone like Winston Churchill, who was excellent because the situation called for it. The moment the war was over, that was not the right approach to drive the organization. The same applies to CEO. If you go in as a first-time CEO to an airline, how are you going to evaluate your own personal risk in the sense that, are we doing the right things?
Do you find that CEOs are generally have quite good self-awareness?
That's a loaded question.
Well, thanks for joining us, Torbjorn. The question I really need to ask at the beginning, Torbjorn, is what was your earliest experiences, like growing up in Sweden, that kind of explain the person you are today?
Ooh. It has to be around aviation since my dad was a pilot. So growing up in helicopters, and there was different times. So my dad would go for navigation exercises and, you'd come along, go ice fishing or something. So aviation has been a core part of my life since I was very, very young. And of course, that shaped me.
So the person who you would say had maybe the biggest influence on your life was your father?
Certainly on my career, in my early career, absolutely. Because he is the one that made it clear to me that I wanted to do something in aviation. And he enabled me at many different ways to pursue that dream, whether it was getting my first pilot license or getting my first job in many ways. So yes, he shaped me. Clearly, my mother had a big influence too, but my dad certainly on the work side.
What was your dad's involvement in aviation?
So my dad was a little bit unique because he was actually Army first. Then he went to the Air Force to learn how to fly, but didn't complete because of my grandmother. But then when helicopters came along during the Vietnam War, he then went back into the Army, started flying helicopters, and then ran the helicopter training center in Sweden. He then went on to fly commercially, flew on oil rigs in Norway before he transitioned into OEMs. Correct.
So you lived in Norway?
My first overseas experience in Norway is when he was flying on the rigs, and then in the Middle East when he was selling Cessna and Bell helicopters. So my entire life was always around aviation as he moved his career forward.
Okay. And he was working in Norway and also the Middle East. So the family followed?
Correct.
So you lived in Norway for quite a period?
So I was in Stavanger during the early days of the oil boom. Not that I remember anything, but I've seen the photos. But then in the Middle East, 77 to 79, when he built up what was supposed to have been a sales and maintenance facility for Cessna and Bell.
Was that in Dubai or?
Office was in Dubai, we lived in Sharjah, but considering the times you're in today, that was disrupted by the Iran and the Shah of Iran being toppled, which then completely changed the business dynamics for that region at that time. So yes, it's 40 years of continuous disruption.
If we look at your career, Torbjorn, like you started your career in Asia. Yeah. What brought you out to Asia? Like, why did you come to this region? Like, you could have developed your career in Sweden.
I could have, but it goes back to my father being a big influence. So I was doing my master's studies in Sweden, but we have to do military service, or at that time it was compulsory. So my studies were broken up by going to the Army for 2 years. And then I came back, and it coincided with me going down to see my parents who had moved to Jakarta. So my dad set up a facility here in Asia for a Swedish aerospace company. So I came down, and he realized that maybe me going back to university to do mechanical engineering was not the right career path for me. So through a number of different things, we got to the point where we ended up instead starting our own company. So when my dad left FFV, which would have been back in '88, we then started our own consulting company, which we then took to Bangkok in 1989. Yeah, so from an early days, my dad saw the opportunity and effectively represent Swedish organizations. So when FFV did change their organization, we took over and represented them in quite a few markets selling different types of technologies and products.
So not everyone would know who FFV.
So it was depot level maintenance for the Swedish Air Force that had been turned into also doing civil stuff. So a very broad aerospace organization. They owned companies that still exist today, like Aerothrust. So that was the segue into me then starting to work in aviation.
And in terms of your career now, your current job, you're at Korn Ferry. Maybe you tell us a bit about what you currently do.
It's very different, but now about almost 20 years ago, actually, I did a transition into headhunting. And Korn Ferry is the world's largest human capital advisory firm. So we work on both organizational design as well as the people that go into that organization. So I sit in Singapore, I look after industrial practice for ASEAN, as well as the aerospace and civil aviation practice out here in the region. So we work with airlines, we work with airports, we work with MROs, OEMs, both to help them figure out the right organizational structure to be effective in their business plan, then also help them find the right leaders to drive that change.
I see.
Which is a nice way of combining everything I've been doing across my career.
After you were working in Bangkok, and that you've worked for a few different aerospace companies over the years.
Yes, Bangkok was great. I mean, Bangkok was exciting. It was a fantastic time. In the late 80s, Asia became a growth engine for the world. So it was a really exciting place to be here. And Thailand was developing very rapidly, but Thailand did have some political challenges. My father had moved off to KL to set up the Malaysia office where we were working with the new airport, KLIA, which was being built at the time. And eventually, though, the turmoil in Thailand led to a complete change of their infrastructure plan, and a lot of the planned airports didn't happen. So I then took the opportunity to join Saab and moved to Hong Kong and looked after aircraft sales in effectively Southeast Asia, selling the Saab 340 and then later the Saab 2000.
And the fact that you're from Sweden, you must have been very happy.
It did have something to do with it. I think I was probably the only Swede in Asia at the time doing commercial aviation work who was not employed by Saab already. So it was an opportunity for them, and it was a great opportunity for me. And I worked with a man you might remember, Martin Craigs, who also did play a big role in influencing my early career.
So Saab did have some success in Asia with quite a few operators.
It's forgotten today to some degree unless you're in the industry, but the Saab 340 was really the aircraft that truly launched regional commuter flights. We had Taiwan with Formosa Airlines. That was big, now part of China Airlines. We had for a while a cargo operator in Malaysia, but it was an evolving market. Saab had the biggest share at the time. I think we were doing a great job, but it's a market that was driven by a combination of entrepreneurship and capital, but very much the regulatory side. And ASEAN 30 years ago is not ASEAN today. There were no open skies. There were mainly national carriers. And there was a general belief that no Asian would ever fly anything but a full-service carrier. So things have changed in 30 years. But Saab did do very well out here. And of course, Saab did very well in Europe and in the US too. So we dominated that space.
I have to ask you though, Torbjorn, you were head of sales for Southeast Asia, but then of course that day came when Saab announced that they were going to shut down the Saab 340 and the Saab 2000 program.
Yeah.
So when that call came through, like what was your response? How did you overcome that setback?
Well, it was kind of tough, I think, because it took a lot of us by surprise. With hindsight, it shouldn't, and that shaped my career in the future because it was quite obvious that we were in trouble. I think actually with real hindsight, it started already the day I joined, because I joined in 92, and that was the first year we actually had declining sales and increasing deliveries. So we kind of reached a peak around 92. But it took us a long time to realize that the market wasn't going the right direction. We didn't have the right cost structure. And probably it was quite clear 18 months before. But I really loved the team I work with. It was a great company, it was a great product, we have a great team, it was fun. So I kind of put my head in the sand and didn't think about it until the day it happened, and I suddenly found myself with no job. But yeah, it did teach me some lessons around do not ignore your environment. Pay attention to what's happening to your organization. There are times when you should join and there are times when you should leave. Don't be naive. And I should have left earlier. I'm glad I didn't. It worked out, but still, should have paid more attention. I think if we go back 20, 30, 40 years in time, the norm was that you stayed in an organization throughout your career. It's what you aspire to do. You went to work for a great company and you had a career for life. The way the world is moving today with disruption, with technology and change, that's kind of unlikely, I think. The second one is that there was also always an implicit agreement, and out here you saw the same in Japan and Korea, that the organization will always look after you. And that created sometimes uneven relationships between the employer and the employee. Because it's clear that organizations are out to look after their interests, the shareholders' interests. As an employee, you must also look after your own. So I think you need to be much more active in shaping your career. As in, you need to have an idea of where you're going and why. And that can be audacious. I mean, I've met plenty of people who said in their 20s, I'm going to be a CEO. The good thing is that that doesn't mean it will happen. But if you've been very good at articulating and you have a plan, it makes it far more likely it will, if you're also capable. But yeah, take control of your own career, shape it, be recognizant of why you do the career shifts you move, and build networks. Because when I left Saab, I ended up with Rockwell Collins, which was our avionics provider. And so clearly it was through Bill Bernor, who was then running the region out here, that I knew well. But that idea of taking charge, building on your career, we talk a lot about careers being T-shaped. You need to be deep in something, but you also need to be broad. Connecting the dots and see how things come together is really, really important. And you can do that when you shape your own career.
You mentioned earlier on, like Martin Kreggs, who was your boss at Saab, and how he had an influence on you. How important it is to have a mentor?
I'd say incredibly important. Mm-hmm. I mean, the interesting thing with mentors or working for bosses is you learn as much from good bosses as you learn from bad bosses. Some would argue that you learn more from bad bosses. I think the key here, though, is learning. Is that what do you take away from the person you work for? And frankly, it is the same with your parents. I've seen so many people have their career shaped by parents, sometimes because of what their parents did right, and sometimes what they did wrong. But it's that self-awareness of how is that impacting us, and what are we going to do? And but clearly, if you have a good mentor, that person can not only help accelerate your journey by seeing who you are and what you can do, but it can also help challenge you. So you can quickly get access to roles and situations that others would not be able to give to you. So a mentor is incredibly important.
Is there a way to identify if there might be good mentors in that organization? Could that be part of your decision making as to whether to join a certain company?
I think so. The challenge, of course, is that there's a difference between your junior and your senior. Once you've been in a career, and this is the advantage with staying in adjacent fields, you will have a network. But the great thing with today, there's lots of information out there. So you can go to Glassdoor, you can go and do research. I think you can build a view of how good an organization is. Now you have to be skeptical with everything you read online. Even same when you do references, people all say what they think about the organization. It may not be applicable to you. But having that view about the organization, how good it is, how bad it is, you can go and see what did people in similar roles go on to do after. Are they being recruited? Is this an organization where people stay and get lost? Or is this an organization, a springboard? But you can absolutely do a degree of evaluation. I always say to people that if you're trying to figure out what you want to do, think about the 5 people you really want to work for and the 5 companies you really want to work for. Then do the research and say why.
I want to ask you about talent retention too, Torbjorn. Like you've pretty much stayed within the aviation industry. Like even though you're now in the recruitment business, aviation is a big sector that you serve. Why is aviation one of those industries that people tend to stay in once they're in?
Because I think it's a passion industry. So it is an industry which is incredibly exciting. I mean, there are other industries that have similar complexity. Nuclear has the same complexity on safety. I think you have on shipping the same complexity around scale of moving things around on B2B. You have obviously technology sectors which are more sophisticated on the technology. You have finance. But if it's one of the few sectors that when you put it all together, it's really an exciting and unique industry. There is something sexy about airplanes, there's no way around it. And it is such a cornerstone in shaping our world today. It is what connects people, it's what connects companies, it's what makes trade and business flow. So I think it's one of those industries that you can be really excited about. Now, obviously, people are the same thing about automotive or data, but I think aviation, it gets into you. And it does mean that people tend to stay, which is good. But I think we're going back to thinking about shaping your career. You still need to ask yourself every once in a while, am I learning everything I can in this sector? And are there other sectors that are ahead? So we talk a bit about there's best practice and then there's next practice. And airlines are very good at best practice, benchmarking, and doing better than their peers. It's an efficiency play. But true innovation and true change often happens in adjacent industries. So, and that's one of the reasons why I like what I do today, right? It's because I do aviation a lot, but I also get involved with other organizations and see what they do. And it's that broadening of your thinking, which has a real impact on both your impact to the organization and how well the company is doing.
How is the aviation industry, or maybe airlines in particular, tracking in terms of staff retention? Are they still very strong at retaining their staff, or is it a situation where there's still room for improvement when it comes to retaining and developing their personnel?
People like to work for organizations that are successful and win. People want to work for an organization where someone says, wow, you work for them, that's a fantastic organization. And I think if you go and look at organizations like Emirates or British Airways or Singapore Airlines, AirAsia out here, have all at various times of their history been exactly in that spot. Then the world changes and business models evolve and things change. But I think that the industry, when it is at its top, does a really good effort at retaining its talents. But we are a very cyclical industry. I think also we struggle a little bit to retain talent around those areas where there is disruption. So particularly on the technology side, where I don't think we're at the forefront anymore. Or the reality is that we call it the exciting but the unsexy side of an airline is walking at a ramp when it's 40 degrees and refueling it. That's something which we have to do a better job of explaining why that's exciting for people. And we probably have to do a better job of rotating people to give them that breadth of experience. But could the industry do better? Yes. Are we doing pretty well considering the circumstances? For sure.
What's some sort of tips or advice you could give to airlines in terms of, if they want to develop their C-suite, what are some of the things they need to be thinking about?
If we think back to that T learnings, go deep and go broad. One of the things that has changed in the airline industry as we've pursued the efficiency play is we've moved to much more streamlined organizations. If we think back to SAS like 30 years ago when they were a travel and leisure company, the airline was one component. Even here 15, 20 years ago in Singapore, Singapore Airlines Group had SATs, they had SIAEC, all as wholly owned subsidiaries. Today, most airlines are relatively lean. That's great from an efficiency and a cost perspective. The challenge is that it's not broadening leaders. So if you look at a lot of airlines today, not all, but many of them have a single P&L at the airline group level where everything rolls up to. The key, though, today to running a successful business is understanding how to make money overall. So organizations that do better are those that stress test their leaders in various sizes and scales of complexity around the P&L. So I think where airlines could do a better job is to recreate that a little bit. How do they either internally through an organizational model find true business ownership at multiple levels? Or how do they partner? How do they find other ways for their people to get out there and run a business and be held accountable for delivering real results? And not lost in the complexity of the whole business. And we see this when airlines want to promote. It is often when the internal candidate steps up to be the airline CEO, it's the first time he has full P&L responsibility. Particularly if it's come out of operations side, but even if they've come out of commercial. And that is a big step change. There is also the complexity, I think, out in a lot of markets here in Asia, which is, do you have the right stakeholder engagement skills? So how do you strike a balance between being an expert at running the business you're in, but operating within the environment and the context in which you have to be successful? That's why in some situations you see an airline expert comes in, parachuted in to run it, because the airline is the most important part. In other elements, you see a local CEO, perhaps no airline experience, be selected, but that's because the stakeholder engagement is important. And in this industry, stakeholder management is incredibly important. It's a very regulated, an industry which often brings secondary benefits to an entire nation and economy, which means that it's got broad political implications.
In terms of being an airline CEO, it is one of the toughest jobs because you have to be an expert on so many different things. Like you mentioned, you've got to have a really good understanding of regulatory, also an understanding of government and government relations. You have to know about, I guess, aircraft maintenance, engineering, have an appreciation for that, have some understanding of flight operations, have some understanding of branding, because as you mentioned earlier, brand is so important as well. So yeah, to be a successful CEO, you kind of have to be an expert in so many different areas. So yeah, how do airlines make sure that they shape their future leadership to be able to do that? Like in the past, I guess they would move people around the organization to develop those skills. Do they still do that?
I think they still do. You look at IAG, for example, you look at Qantas, they have a breadth of organizations they can move people around. But I would say that the organizations that do really well do two things. They do that, moving people around, giving them different experiences, challenging them, testing them. But they also do select external recruiting. I think that's becoming even more important right now as technology is beginning to play a much more important role. We certainly believe that there's a change in the career path of an airline CEO, and the commercial side becomes much more important. So recruiting people from the outside, and New Zealand, for example, has been very good at doing this, and bringing people in at a C-suite level. And after 2, 3, 4, 5 years, when succession happens, they're no longer seen as an outsider. They've learned the operational side. We also know that one of the challenges of recruiting to airlines externally is personal reputational risk. If you go in as a first-time CEO to an airline, the risk that something goes wrong, this industry, thank God, has a really, really good track record, but things still go wrong. If you don't understand the business you're in, how are you going to evaluate your own personal risk in the sense that, are we doing the right things? So by bringing someone in at slightly low pressure positions first, you can make people also feel comfortable with their own capability to manage it. So yeah, you have to do all of it. You have to do internal rotation, departments, businesses, you have to have the right structure, but you do need to recruit from the outside too. It also helps to shape the culture, it helps to drive innovation, and it helps with diversity. We tend to think about diversity mainly as male or female, but diversity is diversity of experience, diversity of thoughts. In a room of people, you want people to have come to the table with different perspectives. So if you never recruit from the outside, you end up with a pure aviation perspective. And if you then never recruit from your own country because of various reasons or constraints, you end up with a country perspective. And aviation is a global business. You can be very successful in your home market, but your competition is global.
I'm going to change topic a bit, getting back to CEOs. There was a statement that Jensen Huang made. He was asked that, what do you define as smart? And he said somebody who can see around corners, somebody who can preempt problems before they show up because they just feel the vibe.
Yeah.
Is that something that a CEO needs to be able to do?
I think what maybe you call agility is super important, more than ever. So I think if we ignore the big blow up geopolitical disruptions that we keep having, particularly from a technological perspective, we've been marching down a fairly predictable path. We all knew electric cars were going to come. We've known that computers are going to keep getting better and better. So we've had some degree of certainty around where we're going, which is why you've seen so many organizations go to an efficiency, productivity model. It's largely been about being the best at what you do from a delivery perspective. If that's what you're trying to do, you probably don't need to see around the corner that much. But if you think the world is going to be disrupted, if you think the world will change, and if we look at everything that's happening right now, whether you believe in global warming or not, it's clear that the weather is changing what is happening. It's clear that we're living in a less stable environment. It's also clear in my mind that AI will have an implication. And if we look at aviation, I don't think we have a technology path. We're still talking about, is it going to be electrical? Is it going to be hydrogen? Is it going to be rail instead of aviation? So I think that ability to be agile, both to spot opportunities and act on them, but also respond in a different way matters. It's not just the CEO's job, though. It's the leadership team. There are plenty of organizations where the CEO is really good at just going out there and working on stakeholders. Maybe not at all good at the strategy and operating. And maybe the COO is really, really good at doing it. It's a team effort. But the organization as a whole must have a very strong strategic perspective. They must be very good at scenario planning. And they must, as a team, come together and be diverse in discussing what to do and when to do it. And then they need to execute. So is it more complicated to be a leadership team today? Arguably, I would say yes. But it doesn't have to be the CEO who does all of it. That's the key. It has to be the leadership group that can do it. And then you have to choose which role each one of them plays. Generally, CEO is the more visible one. But I can think of examples where the COO has been far more visible than the CEO. So it's about finding also the right balance of the team and what suits each individual.
Yeah. I want to go back to an earlier point you made, which you also talked about the importance of the team.
Yeah.
And in our conversation, we've talked a lot about the importance of the CEO.
Yeah.
But actually, CEOs cannot really achieve much unless they have a very good team. In terms of like your job, you're involved in helping to put together a team for a company.
Yeah.
What's the certain things you take into consideration, and how important is sort of the personality of the different players?
Well, all you got to do is look at sports teams, right? You can have a sports team full of stars that fail to perform. Individualism is not great in team performance unless it comes together. I think what it starts with, though, is too often when we look at what we need in leaders and teams today, we look backwards. So we sit and design a job specification, a job description, which lists what a person should have done, some of the skills they need, and we say that's the person we want. But that's rearwards looking. The idea is that we need to be forward looking and say, it's not what do we need today, what do we need our leaders to have 5 years from now, 7 years from now? What do we want them to achieve? So outcome, clear outcome oriented. You can then start putting together, particularly if you do this for the CEO, a real clarity around what does the organization need to do and what does the CEO lead. But then there's the softer skills, right? How does this person effective at leading teams, working with stakeholders, inspiring, bringing people along for the journey? So we will always have trade-offs. But if you've got clarity around what you want the CEO to have and what's most important and what the organization wants to do, you can start building this bigger picture and saying the CEO brings 60% here. How do we complement the 40% that's missing? And you can now start putting together a much greater clarity around the top team's composition and how they will do it. And by the way, this applies to boards too. And then you start making decisions when you look at individuals. Who is most likely going to be effective in this organization? So maybe you have all the experience, maybe you have the personality, maybe you have the skills, but you're not a team player or you're operating at a completely different wavelength. Maybe you run way too fast for the organization's ability to change. So you can look at the whole team, top team effectiveness. The good thing is that if you got the right team, you can also do lots of things to bring them together and make them more effective. But this takes a lot of work. And in an industry that tends to run, it's easy to say, we need this guy, we need that guy. And what the board needs to do is to stop, pause, reflect. And interestingly enough, listen. Because too often when people say they want and what they really want are two different things. Maybe it might be a way of their politics, but often it's about an inability to express their thoughts. So we see often, for example, that when we look for a CEO, that the board is completely aligned on what they want in the person. But then when we start talking about them how to achieve it, half the board might think of the fact that the strategy is set and the CEO is therefore largely executing. The other half of the board feels that the strategy is good, but it needs to be re-verified, the world is changing, so they need someone who's strategic. Same mission, two very different ways of looking at how to achieve it. And that, if they're not aligned on this up front, they will also not align on the right CEO. Or whichever one they pick, the other half will think it was the wrong choice. So that open, honest dialogue around creating what we would call a success profile is incredibly important, and I don't think enough time is spent on that. And that also means bringing the key stakeholders in, not just those that make the actual decision, but other people that will directly have a say in this person's success or indirectly have a say in it. So broadening the conversation, bringing people on board more clearly is really important.
Because you also mentioned about how like the CEO might be good at say 60%, but there's this other 40% where maybe they're not so strong, and you need to find people to kind of plug the gap. Do you find that CEOs are generally have quite good self-awareness about what they're good at and what they're not good at, or is it a situation where they think they're good at something but they just don't really, they're actually not?
That's a loaded question. But I think it varies. As a rule, not everyone is self-aware. But even more importantly, even if you're self-aware, are you doing something about it? Right? There's a lot of people that are aware that they are, too loud or too fast or too complicated, yet they do nothing about it. So there's self-awareness and doing something about it. Now, CEOs tend to be driven. CEOs tend to be type A personality to some degree. That's why they're at the top of the organization. So they tend to drive and drive hard. I think the issue, though, is very few leaders are good at every situation. And what I mean with that is there are leaders, think historically about someone like Winston Churchill, who was excellent at driving in an I use the word authoritarian style, top-down driven, hard-charging, because the situation called for it. The moment the war was over, that was not the right approach to drive the organization, the country forward. The same applies to CEOs. So the self-awareness is also those CEOs are the ones that say, my mission is over. I've done what I'm really good at, what I like to do, and now I'm handing over a team who's ready for the next phase. I do think most CEOs are aware of how to do that. I think most boards are. Then events overtake them. People leave, you go from everything is clear to suddenly there's disruption, just stay one more year. So it's hard to stay on track. And the best laid plans, right, have a tendency to be challenged. But I would argue most people with a little bit of help and nudging are self-aware and knows what to do about it and can build it. There are clearly CEOs out there with big egos that maybe are not so good at this. But not everyone can be perfect. But the board plays a really big role. And the team. I mean, a high-performing team is one where there is enough trust that you can challenge each other. And a secure, mature CEO should have a team around him that can also call him or her out if they're not doing the right things. So again, if you build the right organization with the right team around you, if you're not doing the right things, your team should tell you. Which is why all of these little things, when they come together, it makes the real difference between a high-performing organization and one that is struggling.
No, thanks a lot, Torbjorn, for joining me today, because I really enjoyed this conversation, because I know we tend to get caught up in the day-to-day and talking about what's happening in current events and, certain things happening with certain airlines. But I think it's really important to talk about what we've talked about today, which is about people development.
Yeah.
And how do we innovate? Because these are topics that are always going to be relevant.
Correct.
It's not day to day.
Leadership is at the heart of it, without a doubt. And I think it's interesting how much of what we do and who we are shaped by our career, our early days. And the more we're aware of who we are and why we do things, and the more we complement our strengths and build organizations around us, and same applies with friendships and networks, the better we are for it. So leadership is truly at the heart of everything.